I want you to picture someone very specific for a second. Um, think of that one friend you always call when you're just having a genuinely terrible day. You know the exact person I'm talking about.
Oh, absolutely. We all have that one person.
Right. Now, if you're being totally honest with yourself, this friend probably isn't like the funniest person you know.
Probably not.
And they probably aren't the absolute smartest person in your contacts list either. They might not even give the most brilliant tactical advice.
Yeah.
And yet, somehow, without fail, you always feel better after talking to them.
Yeah, you hang up feeling, I don't know, just lighter.
Exactly. You hang up the phone feeling calmer, more centered, and just fundamentally understood. So why is that? Like, what exactly are they doing that makes you feel so good while conversations with other people leave you feeling utterly drained?
It's a really profound question. And it's a phenomenon that goes far beyond just being a quote-unquote good listener in the traditional polite sense of, making eye contact and nodding.
Which is exactly what we are getting into with today's deep dive. We are pulling from Charles Duhigg's fascinating book, Supercommunicators: How to Unlock the Secret Language of Connection. Our mission today is to extract the literal brain science, the hard biological mechanisms, and the actionable frameworks behind why some conversations soar while others just crash and burn.
Right. We really want to figure out what your favorite friend is doing intuitively.
Yes, and how you can actually train yourself to do it on purpose.
Because communication, at its core biological level, it isn't just about exchanging words. It's not tossing data back and forth like a tennis ball. Duhigg's research reveals that true communication is actually a process of neurological synchronization.
Neurological synchronization.
Yeah, when a conversation is working, your brains and your bodies are literally aligning.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because going from the abstract, warm and fuzzy idea of a great conversationalist to the biological reality of our brains physically syncing up that's quite a leap.
It sounds like sci-fi, honestly.
It really does.
Yeah.
So what is actually happening inside our nervous system when we talk to someone and get that rare feeling that we're just effortlessly clicking?
Well, that feeling of clicking is a biological reality known as neural entrainment. To understand how it works, we can look at this fascinating study conducted by researchers at the Max Planck Institute.
Oh, the guitar study.
Exactly, the guitar study.
Mm-hmm.
They hooked up guitarists to highly sensitive brain scanners. When these musicians were playing their guitars separately in the same room, just focusing on their own individual sheet music, their brain activity looked completely different. It was chaotic, independent noise.
Just normal, separate brains doing their own thing.
Right. But the moment they segued into playing a duet together, the electrical pulses inside their craniums fundamentally changed. They began to synchronize. On the monitors, it looked as if their minds had literally merged into a single functioning network.
Wait, so they were sharing the exact same brainwave patterns just by playing the same song?
Yes, and the synchronization cascaded down through their entire nervous system. Their breathing rates aligned. Their hearts began to beat in similar patterns. Even their pupils, they dilated and constricted in perfect tandem.
That is wild.
It really is. It's an evolutionary survival mechanism. To create harmony, our biology attempts to mirror the biology of the person we are interacting with.
Okay, but that makes sense for musicians playing a highly structured duet, right? Because they're following the same rhythm.
Yeah.
But does that same physical synchronization happen when we're just sitting across a table having a casual conversation over coffee?
It absolutely happens in conversation. In fact, it is the prerequisite for actual comprehension. Scientists at Princeton measured the brain activity of a group of people listening to a woman tell a really long, convoluted, totally unscripted story about her high school prom night. And as she spoke, the listeners' brains began to entrain with hers. Whenever she recalled a moment of social anxiety, the listeners' brains experienced the exact same spikes of stress. When she described a moment of joy, their pleasure centers lit up precisely when hers did.
So they were feeling what she was feeling biologically.
Precisely. And the crucial takeaway was this. The listeners whose brainwaves synchronized the most closely with the speaker were later able to recall the most accurate details about her story. True understanding only happens when our neural impulses physically map onto the other person's.
I read about this crazy experiment at Dartmouth conducted by a researcher named Bo Sievers that tried to test this. He wanted to figure out why some people are so much better at creating this neurological synchronization than others.
Oh, the silent movie clip study.
Yes. And his methodology was just bizarre. He took a bunch of volunteers and made them watch these incredibly confusing, completely silent movie clips. One clip was just Brad Pitt taking a bath while Casey Affleck stared at him from a doorway.
Yes, it's such a weird clip to use.
Right. No context, no dialogue, no sound.
Yeah.
Just pure awkwardness. How do you even measure communication based on a silent bathtub scene?
Well, Sievers used those clips because they are completely ambiguous. They're designed to confuse the brain and force it to create its own narrative. When the individuals watched those clips alone, every single person's fMRI scan looked totally different. Everyone was processing the weirdness in their own isolated way.
ASIN.
But then, Sievers put these volunteers into small groups and gave them a task to figure out the plot together.
Okay.
Afterward, he scanned their brains again while they watched the clips a second time.
And their brains had synced up.
Precisely. The groups that had talked about the clips were now neurally synchronized. When Brad Pitt splashed the water, their brains all reacted the exact same way at the exact same millisecond.
Wow.
But here is the critical finding. Some groups were vastly more synchronized than others. The quality of the conversation determined the depth of the neural entrainment.
Now, my immediate assumption when I read the setup for this was that the groups that performed the best, the ones that got totally synced up, they must have had a really strong, dominant leader, like an orchestra needing a strict conductor to keep everyone playing the same song.
That's what most people would guess.
Right. I figured someone had to step in, take charge of the airspace, and corral the group into an agreement.
It's a very natural assumption, especially, in corporate environments. But the data showed the exact opposite. Groups with a strong, dominant leader actually had the least amount of neural synchrony.
Wait, why? If someone is explicitly laying out the plot, shouldn't everyone's brain follow along?
Because a dominant leader, someone who monopolizes the airspace, dictates the direction, and shuts down tangents, creates an environment of compliance, not connection.
Compliance versus connection.
Exactly. When you feel talked at or subtly intimidated, your brain goes on the defensive. You withdraw back into your own separate, isolated thoughts. The groups that achieved the highest synchronization didn't have a dictator. They had what researchers call high centrality participants.
The supercommunicators.
Yes.
Yeah.
And these supercommunicators behaved entirely differently than your typical alpha leader. For one, they actually spoke less.
Really? They spoke less.
They did. But when they did speak, they asked 10 to 20 times more questions than anyone else in the group. They were the first to admit their own confusion, saying things like, I have no idea what is going on here. Does anyone else?
So they made it okay to not know the answer.
Right. They were quick to make fun of themselves. But most importantly, they constantly adjusted their own communication style to match the mood of their group mates. If someone made a joke about the clip, they laughed and matched that lightheartedness. If someone brought up a serious artistic interpretation, the supercommunicator immediately shifted to match that intellectual gravity.
That is such a powerful framework for anyone listening right now. If you want to show true leadership in a conversation, whether you are running a board meeting or sitting at your dining room table with your teenager, your job isn't to dominate the airspace.
Exactly. It's not about being the loudest voice.
Your job is to make the environment safe enough for others to align with you. You have to be the one who asks the questions, admits vulnerability, and matches the vibe.
But to effectively match the vibe, you first have to understand the fundamental architecture of human interaction. This is one of Duhigg's most critical insights. We tend to think of a conversation as one single event. But every single discussion we have is actually made up of 3 completely different types of conversations, each governed by entirely different neural networks.
Okay, break down how these 3 networks actually operate, because this changes everything about how we argue.
Absolutely. To synchronize, we have to recognize what part of the brain the other person is using. The first type of conversation is the practical decision-making conversation. It asks, what's this really about?
Okay, practical.
Right. This activates the frontal control network, which is the brain's command center for logic, planning, and executing tasks. The second is the emotional conversation, which asks, how do we feel? This draws heavily on the amygdala and the hippocampus, the primitive structures tied to processing fear, joy, and memories.
And the third?
The third is the social conversation, which asks, who are we? This utilizes the default mode network, which constantly processes our social identities, our status, and how we relate to the tribe around us.
I love analogies, so let me try to make this relatable. Having a conversation where you are using different neural networks is like trying to play chess with someone while they're trying to play tennis.
Ah, that's a great way to put it.
You are technically on the same court, but you are
Yeah.
playing completely different games, and somebody's going to get hit in the face with a racket. Like, if your partner comes home and starts venting about how their boss is micromanaging them, that is a how do we feel conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Their amygdala is flared up. If you immediately respond with a practical solution like, well, why don't you just invite him to lunch and set some clear boundaries? You are having a what's this really about conversation.
Exactly. You are offering frontal lobe logic when their brain is demanding amygdala empathy.
And neurologically, you cannot hack someone's frontal lobe using their amygdala and vice versa. It registers as a profound disconnect.
It just doesn't work.
But human beings are messy. Like if my coworker is yelling at me because a project deadline was missed, they're highly emotional, but they're also technically asking for a practical fix. So how does the brain even categorize that?
Well, the brain is always layering these networks, but there is always a dominant frequency at any given moment. A great supercommunicator listens for the dominant frequency and matches it first. There's a brilliant shortcut Duhigg suggests for this. The next time someone comes to you with a complex problem, simply ask yourself, or even ask them directly, do you want to be helped, hugged, or heard?
Helped, hugged, or heard. I love that.
It's so simple. If they want to be helped, engage the frontal control network. Offer practical logic and solutions. If they want to hug, engage the amygdala. Offer emotional matching and comfort. If they want to be heard, engage the default mode network. Offer social validation and acknowledge their perspective.
And the stakes for misidentifying these conversations can be life or death. There's this incredible case study in the book of an FBI hostage negotiator named Felix Segala.
Oh, that story is amazing.
Right. The Department of Defense brought him in to teach a room full of highly analytical, incredibly defensive scientists how to communicate better. In 45 minutes, just by asking questions and matching their emotional tone instead of debating their data, he had these hardened researchers opening up about their divorces and their deepest regrets.
It's a perfect example of matching.
But an even more extreme example is Jim Lawler, the CIA recruiter.
Yet Lawler's early career perfectly illustrates the catastrophic failure of mismatched neural networks.
So Lawler was stationed in Europe in the 1980s, trying to recruit foreign spies, and he was failing miserably. Eventually, he meets this young woman from the Middle East named Yasmin, who works in her country's foreign ministry.
And he lies to her at first.
Right, he lies. He says he's an oil speculator and offers her a lucrative consulting gig. She's thrilled. But then his boss forces him to come clean. Lawler sits her down at a restaurant, admits he's actually with the CIA, and immediately tries to pitch her with practical incentives. He offers her money, he talks about helping her overthrow her oppressive government, he lays out this whole logical roadmap.
He was initiating a classic, what's this really about, practical conversation. He was relying entirely on the frontal control network's logic of costs and benefits.
Exactly, but Yasmin's brain isn't anywhere near her frontal control network. She is terrified. She is trapped in a how do we feel conversation, and the feeling is absolute panic.
Because the stakes for her are incredibly high.
Right. She knows her government executes people for speaking to American intelligence. She refuses the money, walks out, and wants nothing to do with him. Lawler's career is basically over. But he manages to convince her to have one last dinner with him before she leaves the country.
And this is where he shifts his strategy.
Because he knows he can't manipulate her with money or practical arguments. So, sitting across from her in silence, Lawler remembers this disastrous sales call he made back in his 20s when he was selling steel in Texas. He'd bonded with a stressed-out business owner simply by admitting how much of an imposter he felt like.
Right.
So with Yasmin, Lawler stops pitching. He just starts talking about how he feels like a failure, how terrified he is that he is bad at his job. He shares his own deep feelings of inadequacy.
What's fascinating here is the physiological mechanism of what Lawler did. He intuitively utilized the matching principle. When he was offering her money and political arguments, Yasmin's amygdala was screaming threat because he was acting like a predator trying to trap her.
Right, he was just giving her data while she was fearing for her life.
Exactly. But by abandoning his practical strategy and offering genuine vulnerability, he shifted the neural landscape. He matched her state of fear with his own state of fear. He didn't just say, I know you were scared. He proved it by exposing his own insecurities. When Yasmin's brain processed his vulnerability, her threat response dialed down. Her brain recognized a fellow human in distress.
She realized they were finally playing the same game on the same court.
Yes. He permitted her to feel safe enough to sync up. And astonishingly, once they were neurally aligned, she changed her mind. She agreed to help him and became one of the CIA's most valuable assets in the region for the next 2 decades.
Okay, but this raises a huge logistical problem. Lawler figured it out because Yasmin's terror was fairly obvious. But how do you figure out which conversation the other person wants to have when it isn't obvious? What if they are hiding it, or what if they don't even know themselves?
That requires engaging in what negotiation experts call the quiet negotiation.
The quiet negotiation.
Yeah, every conversation actually starts with a subtle, almost invisible back and forth where we test the waters to figure out what the underlying goal truly is.
There is a brilliant example of this involving Dr. Bayfar Ide, a prominent prostate cancer surgeon at Memorial Sloan Kettering. He was facing this insane medical paradox in his clinic. For patients diagnosed with low-risk prostate cancer, the statistical data overwhelmingly points to a strategy called active surveillance.
Right, basically you just monitor the tumor.
Exactly. It is far safer than invasive surgery, which carries massive, life-altering risks of permanent incontinence and impotence.
The practical empirical data dictates that active surveillance is the logical choice.
Overwhelmingly. And yet 40% of Dr. Ide's patients were completely ignoring the data and demanding this highly invasive, statistically unnecessary surgery. Now wait, hold on. If I go to a highly trained surgeon, I don't want a quiet negotiation. I want them to give me the raw, objective medical data.
You want the frontal lobe facts.
Exactly. Why is a doctor treating a medical diagnosis like a negotiation when one side is an objective expert and the other side is a layman?
Because, as Dr. Eddy learned, humans do not process raw data when they're terrified. Dr. Ide assumed his patients were in a practical mindset. He assumed they were having a "what's this really about" conversation.
Because they're at a hospital.
Right. So he would bring highlighted medical journals into the exam room to prove the surgery was unnecessary. But what he failed to realize was that these patients were entirely trapped in an emotional mindset. They weren't looking at statistical hazard ratios. They were looking at their own mortality.
Wow.
They were terrified about how their wives and children would handle the lingering anxiety of a cancer diagnosis. They wanted the cancer cut out immediately just to alleviate their family's emotional burden, completely regardless of the statistical safety of waiting.
So throwing more frontal lobe statistics at an amygdala problem was just pushing them further away. How did he fix it?
He sought advice from a Harvard Business School professor named Deepak Malhotra, who specializes in deep negotiation. Malhotra told him to stop leading with data and to initiate the quiet negotiation by asking deeply open-ended questions.
Okay, so what did that look like?
Dr. Edie changed his entire approach. When a new patient came in, instead of handing over a medical study, he would sit down, look them in the eye, and ask, "What does this cancer diagnosis mean to you?"
Which is just a completely open door. It forces the patient to reveal their dominant neural network.
Exactly. And suddenly the patients would start talking about their families, their deepest fears, or how they had watched their own fathers suffer. Dr. Edie finally unearthed their hidden emotional motivations.
Because he actually asked.
Right. And once he realized they were operating on empathetic logic, he matched it. He stopped quoting statistics, he started telling stories, he told them what he would advise his own father to do in their exact situation. He shared narratives of other patients who had chosen active surveillance, gone to their daughters' weddings, and lived long, happy lives.
So he met their emotional anxiety with emotional reassurance.
Yes, and once he matched their mindset, their brains were finally open to hearing the practical medical advice. Unnecessary surgeries in his practice dropped by 30%.
That is the quiet negotiation in action.
Mm-hmm.
If you are listening to this, that is a wildly effective tool you can use today. Start high-stakes conversations by asking broad questions about beliefs, values, and experiences. That is how you surface what the other person truly cares about.
Absolutely.
But I want to push this to the absolute limit. What happens when you aren't dealing with a hidden emotional fear? What happens when you've done the quiet negotiation? You know exactly what the other person wants. They know what you want. But your logic is just fundamentally opposed.
It's like a total deadlock.
Right. How do you sync up when you are completely deadlocked?
That is the ultimate test of a supercommunicator. And we see this play out perfectly in a high-stakes jury deliberation room where two completely different frameworks of logic violently clash.
The book details this fascinating trial from 1985 in Wisconsin. A man named Leroy Reed is on trial. Reed is a convicted felon with severe mental disabilities. He reads at a second-grade level. He bought a mail-order detective course that explicitly told him he needed a gun to be a private eye.
Which is already a tragic misunderstanding.
Exactly. So he went to a store, bought a toy-like .22 caliber pistol, and left it inside his box in his closet. He never used it. He never threatened anyone. He barely understood what it was. But by the absolute strict letter of the law, a convicted felon in possession of a firearm is guilty, and he faces up to 10 years in prison.
Right.
The jury goes into the tiny deliberation room, and they immediately fracture.
They fracture precisely along the lines of two competing logical frameworks. On one side, you have the logic of costs and benefits, the purely practical, rule-based mindset. This is represented by a juror named Carl, who happens to be a fireman.
Right, a very rules-oriented guy.
Exactly. Carl views the world through strict rules, safety checklists, and the preservation of order. To Carl, the law is binary. The rule was broken, therefore Reed is guilty. On the other side, you have the logic of similarities, the empathetic, narrative-based mindset.
Which is the rest of the jury.
Right. Other jurors start relating to Reed's profound confusion. They tell stories about fairness, arguing that the true spirit of justice means letting a harmless, disabled man go free.
Here's where it gets really interesting. You have Carl saying, the checklist says guilty, and the rest of the room saying, our hearts say innocent. They're completely deadlocked. Chess versus tennis again. Enter John Bowley, a literature professor on the jury, who naturally steps into the role of the supercommunicator.
And what does he do?
At first, Bowley leans heavily into the empathetic side, telling vivid stories about what it must have felt like for Reed to hold that gun like a prop in a fantasy. It works beautifully on most of the room. Soon, the vote is 11-1 for acquittal. But Carl, the fireman, absolutely will not budge.
Carl is holding his ground.
Yes, Carl is terrified of the precedent. He argues, if we ignore the written law just because we feel bad for someone, society descends into anarchy. Now, most people in that room just started yelling at Carl, calling him heartless and trying to force empathy down his throat.
Which, as we established, never works. You cannot force someone out of their chosen logic by yelling at them. Instead, you have to find a way to match it. Bowley realized that Carl's ultimate underlying value wasn't actually punishing Leroy Reed. Carl's ultimate value as a fireman and a rule follower was public safety.
Right. So Bowley performs this absolute masterstroke of persuasion. He pivots entirely away from empathy and adopts Carl's practical logic of costs and benefits. Bowley looks at Carl and says, you know what, Carl? You are right. I care about public safety too. My students are getting mugged on campus right now, and the district attorney is wasting our taxpayer money and our time trying to lock up Leroy Reed, a guy who left a gun in a shoebox, instead of hunting down actual violent criminals.
That is brilliant.
Right. He says, if we convict Reed, we are validating the DA wasting resources. If we want to keep the public safe, the most practical thing we can do is acquit Reed and force the police to focus on real violent threats.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Bowley didn't change his own goal. He translated his point into the exact logic that Carl found persuasive. He mapped his empathetic outcome onto Carl's practical framework. He aligned with Carl's values and expanded the pie. He made an acquittal the logical choice for public safety.
And it worked.
And because Bowley finally spoke Carl's language, Carl's brain was able to sync up. Carl finally agreed. The jury unanimously acquitted Leroy Reed. Persuasion is never about bulldozing someone with your superior facts.
Yep.
It is about understanding their logic so deeply that you can make your argument fit perfectly inside their worldview.
That is just incredible. We've covered so much ground today. Let's wrap up this journey. We started with a biological reality that our nervous systems desperately want to sync up.
Right, the neural entrainment.
Exactly. And to make that happen, we have to identify which neural network is dominating the conversation. Are they in a practical, emotional, or social state? Do they want to be helped, hugged, or heard? We have to engage in that quiet negotiation by asking broad, open-ended questions to uncover their true motivations. And finally, when we meet stubborn resistance, we have to map our arguments onto the other person's logic, just like Bowley did with Carl.
And if you are wondering how to start applying this immediately, Harvard researchers offer one incredibly simple, practical preparation hack.
Oh, I love a good hack.
It's so easy. Before you enter into any high-stakes conversation, take just 30 seconds to jot down 2 things on a piece of paper. Write down one specific thing you hope to say, and write down one specific question you want to ask.
Just one of each.
Just one of each. The data shows that this tiny act of preparation dramatically reduces cognitive anxiety and prevents those dreaded awkward pauses, freeing your brain up to focus entirely on syncing with the other person.
So what does this all mean? I want to leave you with something to really mull over. We spend so much of our lives Meticulously curating what we are going to say. We want to sound smart. We want to be interesting. We want to be right. We polish our arguments until they are razor sharp.
Right. We focus entirely on ourselves.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But what if the ultimate conversational cheat code has absolutely nothing to do with the words you are speaking and has everything to do with your willingness to be an emotional chameleon for the person sitting across from you?
That is the real secret.
The next time you feel a conversation going off the rails,
Ah.
or you feel that familiar friction building up in your chest, stop trying to make a better argument. Stop trying to find the perfect data point to prove you are right. Instead, take a breath, look at the person across from you and ask yourself, am I even having the same conversation they are?